Good morning, good evening, and a good late evening for some of us. You're welcome to this platform where we have programmed a very interesting discussion. So welcome to this first session of the seat webinar of the AfricaNEV. So we've had a lot of discussions by our WhatsApp platform. And finally, we have the start of this exciting journey and discussions around electrical vehicles and the transition of energy and African transition to sustainable energy in all sectors. So we focus on the transport sector, but also other sectors. So you're welcome, feel free. My name is Luttah Aluora. I'm one of the moderators of AfricaNEV. Joining me are 4 other very highly talented young men, also moderators of the platform, whom you'll have the opportunity to meet and interact with in this session. Thank you so much for taking time to join us. So over to you, Gat, so that you can introduce our speakers and go on with the panel.
Okay, thank you very much to our beautiful host. Good morning and welcome to the Maiden Seat webinar. My name is Ashiagbor. As you may have heard earlier, I am your moderator for today's panel. And without much ado, I will share my screen to give you my opening remarks. For those who may not know AfricaNEV, the full name is actually African New Energy and Vehicles, and we are a continental non-profit that aims to accelerate the adoption of e-mobility in Africa through policy advocacy, awareness creation, and linking industry players in the emerging African e-mobility value chain. I am one of 5 moderators. You met my colleague Aluora, who is Kenyan, myself, Ashiagbor, I'm Ghanaian. We have our director of e-mobility, who also doubles as the CEO of Think Bikes Limited, Olukokun, who is Nigerian. We have John Misingo, and then we also have Kenneth Kojo Aju-Texan, another Ghanaian. This will be the first of a series of webinars culminating ultimately in the Sustainable Energy and Transport Summit in December. The next session will be on 23rd of February. Why this series of webinars? Because we are trying to reduce or eliminate the misinformation, disinformation, and ignorance about the EV space. Number one, of course, this webinar series will also serve as a networking opportunity for all of us. And ultimately, our aim is to accelerate the rate of adoption on the continent. And this series is targeted mainly at ecosystem players or people who are interested in the emerging ecosystem. And this is what to expect from today's panel. And we have the right people who can answer our questions. So the first speaker is David Wamwayi, who is Kenyan and a consultant with UNEP. He has a vast experience in the transport sector and has undertaken transport studies in sub-Saharan Africa, including in the Eastern, Southern, and the Horn of Africa region as a transport economist. Our second speaker needs no introduction. That's Robert Llewellyn of the Fully Charged channel. Robert has been at this since 2010, and he has 700 videos on YouTube and almost 1 million subscribers. And since 2018, he has been hosting the Fully Charged Live series of events, including this year where they have 6 planned, starting with Australia, if memory serves me correctly. Thank you very much. And we want to give the floor to David for his opening remarks or presentation. David, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll take you through just some key findings of what we prepared at the UNEP in 2021, which is it was a study on used vehicles and the environment. And the purpose of this study was basically to understand in the global south and in developing countries how used vehicles how used vehicles are imported into the various markets and from which sources these used vehicles come from. I'd like to mention that at the moment we are preparing a study on same on used vehicles, but is basically focusing on the heavy duty vehicles. This one for 2021 was focusing mainly on the light duty vehicles. So some of the key findings that we found from this study, I'll just zero in into it directly, was the 4 main exporters of used light duty vehicles are the European Union, Japan, USA, and the Republic of Korea. And it's important to note that between 2015 and 2020, about 23 million used light duty vehicles were exported to 208 countries and territories worldwide across 7 regions from these 4 main exporters, which are the EU, Japan, USA, and Republic of Korea. Now, during this period again, around 66% of the used light-duty vehicles were exported to developing and transitional countries where Africa mainly falls. And you can see this is a significant percent, so you're only left with about 44% to other economies of the world. And from these exports of the used light-duty vehicles to developing and the transitional countries, Africa received the highest share of the exports, which was approximately 24%. And this was followed by Eastern Europe and Caucasus and Central Asia, which received 14%, Asia Pacific 12%, the Middle East 10%, and Latin America and the Caribbean 8%. And this clearly shows that Africa is heavily relies on used vehicle imports from these developing countries, and mainly EU, Japan, USA, and Republic of Korea. And now, from 2015 to 2020, the EU traded around 11.5 million used light-duty vehicles, 58% of which remained within the EU, and 42% being exported outside the EU. Used light-duty vehicles traded within the EU countries plus imports from USA, Japan, and Republic of Korea to the EU was approximately 31% of the total units traded globally. So as we can see, used vehicles, the trade of it is within and also outside countries. And for the period of 2015 to 2020, the EU remained the largest exporter of used light-duty vehicles, considering trade within and outside EU at 49%, followed by Japan at 26%, USA at 18%, and Republic of Korea at 8%. Now, something key to note here is, if you look at Africa, mainly Africa is usually divided into partly Anglophone and Francophone. And you'll notice that most of the Francophone import from the EU and most of the Anglophone import from Japan. Something just very interesting, and this will be shown in the chart that we'll be illustrating towards the end of this presentation or this discussion. And between 2017 and 2020, the EU, Japan, and Republic of Korea exported a total of 760,139 hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and battery-powered electric used vehicles globally. And data for the EU and Republic of Korea was for light-duty vehicles, whereas while for Japan, this included light-duty vehicles and buses. It's important to note that data for America during this period when we were doing this research or this study was unavailable. And of the 146 developing and transitional country studies to determine their used light-duty vehicle imports policies, there has been progress since 2020 on regulations for ensuring better quality used vehicles. From 47 countries with good or very good policies, this has now increased to 62 countries. And this has been clearly shown, for example, in countries such as, for example, Kenya, where now the importation, the age of imports has been reduced from around 7 years to up to about five years there. And countries are continuing to implement this. Other countries are also going towards ensuring that we have regulations for importing the Euro 4s. And this will be seen in the next description, whereby since the previous report, which we carried out in 2015 to 2017, 15 countries of the ECOWAS region, that is Economic Community of West African States, sub-region, have adopted a vehicles directive for Euro 4 equivalent emission standards with implementation from January 2021. When you look at countries in Latin America, you can see that Peru adopted Euro 6 emission standard in October 2021 with an implementation date of October 2024 concurrently with 10 ppm fuels. Cambodia, on the other hand, which is in Asian, that is Southeast Asia, adopted Euro 4 emission standards this year, which will be implemented by end of 2021. And at the same time, in our continent, Ethiopia introduced in 2019 higher taxations for light-duty vehicles of up to 500% to discourage importation of older light-duty vehicles. So just to give you some statistics, which we have also in the report, which I'll not be able to show it currently, but I'll be able to mention. In Africa, 900,191 used light-duty vehicles were imported. That is between 2015 and 2020. And the distribution by sub-region is as follows, and this is important to note. In Western and Central Africa, it was 52%, which is equivalent to 464,518 units. In North Africa, we had 24%, which is equivalent to 214,153 units. And in Eastern Africa, we had 17%, which is equivalent to 148,581 units. And in Southern Africa, we had 8%, which was equivalent to 72,939 units. I just want us to focus mainly on Africa. And as you can see in the arrows shown in the graph there in the chart, you can see the movement of used vehicles, how they move globally, and from which countries they come from. So we have the bright, I would like to call it either yellow, dark yellow or dark orange, that is Europe. Then we have Japan, which is the dark blue or dark grayish there. Then we have red, which is South Korea. And then we have sort of the dark, it's a dark black, which is United States. Then we have band. You can see how Africa is divided, and you can see basically the countries in the south, towards the south. You can see most of their imports mainly originate from Japan, whereas in the north, apart from just one country, most of the imports, and in the West Africa, most of the imported vehicles originate from Europe. So in relation to this, what I'd like to say is this data clearly shows that in terms of Africa switching towards EVs, it will be instantaneous, like it will happen so quick, because these are the sources of the used vehicles, and most of the vehicles in use in Africa, most of the vehicles used in Africa are actually used vehicles, and they are imported from these markets. So when these markets change and production of the ICE reduces, then this will have a significant impact in Africa, and Africa will also have to shift with a shift towards EVs. And this will also have a direct impact on climate change in terms of the reduction in emissions. As we've seen, countries such as Ethiopia are imposing heavy fines and heavy penalties for importation of old light-duty vehicles. And now, even with the results for the heavy-duty vehicles, which will likely come out sometime this year, we'll also like to share with the platform, maybe by the time we get to December, shows that even with the importation of the EVs will also enable us to renew our vehicle fleet age. It's important to note that also our vehicle fleets are quite old, and they need usually quite replacement of spare parts, quite replacement of maintenance, heavy maintenance to be undertaken on them. And with these vehicles coming in, then they really help transform the African market and also the African mobility space. I think I'd like to leave it at that, Gad. Hope I've been audible and I've been able to deliver the point.
Thank you very much, David. That was concise, precise, accurate, and on time. Food for thought. Our fleet is mainly from used vehicles, mainly from Europe, for the western and the northern parts, mainly for Japan from the eastern, and as well as from the southern parts. Thank you very much. I think, Robert, your opening thoughts on the EV adoption, how you see the transition from your perspective in Europe and the general global automotive industry landscape.
Very good. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak here. It is a huge privilege for me, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity. And I just want to say also a big thank you to David, because I learned so much in that very short presentation about the situation in Africa, how cars end up in Africa. It's the sort of thing that, as an outsider from Africa, we wouldn't think about. You go, of course, yes, they were being imported. And actually, the way that it's split is also really fascinating. And I think it will have an effect on the vehicles that you have access to, interestingly, because I think in some ways, I've got to mention Toyota are one of the really big car companies that are resisting and delaying the adoption of electric vehicles, which is really peculiar because they were one of the first ones to really embrace hybrids, and they've done an amazing job of that. And I drove a Toyota Prius for many years, and it was an amazing car, and it really made a difference. In a way, it started me thinking, and we're talking 20 plus years ago, started me thinking about how we use fossil fuel, how it's become a normal part of our lives. And when you start to question that, quite a lot of our normal world sort of unravels, and we then go, well, hang on, where does this petrol, gasoline and diesel come from? What do we have to do to make sure we have access to it? What impact does it have on the world we all live in? And I think those are the kind of critical underlying questions. And I'm a critic of the fossil fuel industry, but also at the same time, I acknowledge that it has had an enormous impact on the world in the last 100 years. It's changed the world we live in beyond recognition, and it has helped an enormous number of people climb out of very, very abject poverty. And I'm talking all over the world, not just in Africa or not just in Europe. It's been a global change, and we have to acknowledge that. But I think we've also now reached a point in the development of the human race, if you like, where we can create technologies and use technologies that help us, that don't require us to burn fuel. And that's really, for me, the crucial argument here, is if you need to burn fuel to make something work, to carry out a task, then you've got a problem. Because when you burn fuel, two things happen. One, there's the residue from that burning, and two, you've got to get some more stuff to burn because you've burnt the first lot. You can't burn it again. If we could burn diesel and petrol 3 times or 5 times, it will be amazing, but we can only burn it once. And then we've got to start again. And the difference between that and then an electric vehicle that is, say, charged from solar power or wind power is a complete change in not only in technology, but in thinking and the way we think, the way the energy market works. And I think this is the critical thing. And this is where it becomes really advantageous for Africa, is if you can produce your own fuel, if you like, at the source. So you don't have to have a truck that brings you heavy, toxic and flammable fuel from somewhere else, and it has to drive it there, and you put it in a tank, and then you put it in your car, and then you burn it in your car, then you have to get some more. You could produce the fuel you need for your cars at the place that you leave the cars, at the place you park the cars, where you live, on your house, on your place of work. When I talk about, I've used the word cars, and I think I'm always trying to remind myself not to just say cars. It's ground transport. So yesterday, I'm currently in Australia, and yesterday I was filming a trucking company. Now, they use the biggest trucks on the road. We're talking huge trucks that can pull about 70 to 90 tons of material at one time. So very, very big trucks like they would have in the United States, bigger than we can have in the United Kingdom, much bigger. It's a 100% electric truck. It has batteries that can slide out from underneath it, recharge in a charging station that's powered by solar power. So I drove, 20 miles yesterday, 40 kilometers maybe, in a truck where none of the energy that made that truck move, and it was towing a huge trailer, none of the energy that made that truck move had come from further away than the roof of the building that the truck is housed in. And that changes everything so much. That would mean that you could shift goods around Africa without relying on fuel from elsewhere. You would be able to produce the fuel there. So that combination of solar and electric vehicles is, I think, the critical argument that we need to think of. And it changes everything. For instance, that truck, when the batteries are taken out and put in a charging bay, they're not just left there to charge overnight. They sometimes use the electricity in that to facilitate extra power in the grid. So a power goes both ways all the time. So the materials that we've extracted from the ground, made into machines, are in use all the time. They're not like a car. When you have a car, the majority of the time it's just left standing somewhere, usually in the way of people walking around a city. It's not being used. And when you have an electric vehicle, that vehicle can be in use all the time. It's a mobile battery on wheels. That's the way to think about it. And I think the more vehicles that you can import, and this is where it's going to change, because at the moment there's very few second-hand electric cars, because there's very few electric cars still. The market for second-hand electric cars in Europe, and particularly in the United Kingdom, and I know well, they are really expensive. They maintain their value because we now understand they last longer than petrol and diesel cars. They're more reliable. They need less maintenance. They're less likely to go wrong, not more likely. The batteries last longer than the car. We're not throwing away batteries. No one is going to throw away a battery. So I think the critical points I want to make are, if you can be effectively energy independent, and this isn't about, we'll hold on to our energy. It just means that you can produce the energy at the source that you need it, at the place you need it. That relieves an economy of exporting money to pay for fuel. And that makes a really big difference. And this is why there is resistance to electric vehicles, because the existing industry that supplies us with the fuel is not happy that we can do this. It's taken me a while to understand this, but it is a major challenge to the big oil companies, because we're always going to use oil. It's ridiculous to say we won't use oil, but we'll use so much less of it in future, and it will harm us much less because we won't be burning it. We'll be using it for other things: fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, plastics, all the things that we use the fossil fuel for now. We're not going to stop doing that, but we're not going to be burning it to the same degree that we have done for the last 130 so years. And so that, I think, will change. And I think the huge advantage that you have in Africa is the sun. And I'm currently in Australia. My wife is Australian, my children are Australian, and it's a lot sunnier in Australia than it is in England, and it's very similar to many parts of Africa. And when I see the little part of Australia, I'm in a little suburb. We're in this very small house in a suburb. Every single house, regardless, every single building, every single school, hospital, car park has solar panels on the roof. And they produce an enormous amount of energy for Australia. It's changed their energy landscape. It's meant they burn much less coal to generate power because they don't need the power from the coal plant because it comes off the roof. The house I'm in, the roof is just solar panels. There's nothing else on the roof. The house I can see in front of me is covered in solar panels. And that has been adopted over the last 20 years to a degree now where it's really affected the energy economy of Australia. It's made an enormous impact. And they are now building solar farms in the deserts of Australia that will export power. Rather than exporting coal, it will export electricity to countries in Asia on a scale that we can't really imagine at the moment. We're talking gigawatts of power, not megawatts, and then eventually petawatts of power. So that landscape is going to change whatever happens around the world, and it's changing all over the place. And I think the one market I didn't hear David mention is China. I don't know, we all have complicated relationships between all the countries in the world, but currently China are making more electric cars than anyone else. China has the most electric cars on the road. China produces the most renewable energy of any country on the planet. China is making pretty much everything we all use. Everything I buy in the UK, it says made in China on the back of it. So, that's a very common experience. But the Chinese cars that are coming now are cheaper, really well made, really long lasting with very good software that controls the batteries, that makes the car last longer. They're kind of better than anything that's made in Europe or America. And that's a real challenge for those existing car markets. So I think we're going to see big changes from China, and also not just passenger cars. I think this is the most important thing. It is the first signs of proper usable electric minibuses, for example, are just coming onto the market that have 250, 300 miles, maybe 400 kilometer range, which becomes incredibly useful for countries that use public transport like that. And it's so much more sensible not to have a private car, but to use public transport, or to use a transport system that's shared between everyone. From an economic standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, from a space in cities standpoint, when you see pictures of cities that have just got huge roads through them with tens of thousands of cars, you could shrink that down to one train. It is a crazy way of designing cities. And I think we'll see, then it's going to take a long time, but in the next few years, systems where we can share transport much more easily. So we can still use a car. Cars are very useful when we need to, but we might not own them and leave them lying about in our cities while we're not using them. I think they'll be used more, and they will be an integral part of our energy network in any country.
So in your opening remarks, you talk about the legacy auto companies, specifically Toyota, for example, and the initial work they did on Toyota Prius, and then how, when it comes to battery electric vehicles, they seem to be offering a resistance to that. And from our earlier presentation, clearly that have an implication for Africa, because especially the eastern and the southern part of the continent that imports a lot of used vehicles from Japan, this will be a problem. We just speak about the economic benefits of the transition in terms of not having to reducing our import bill. That's very interesting, because in my country, for example, 20% of all imports is fuel. Okay, and we import virtually everything. So you can think about the economic impact if you have to wipe away all that money. You talk about energy independence. You talk about the similarity between Australia and Africa. I think that's a whole conversation, because in terms of climate, in terms of mineral resources that we can have later. We did talk about China and China's impact, and I think we'll cycle back to that, especially with respect to the batteries. And then we spoke about public transport and its implications. Okay, thank you very much. I think my first question will go to David. David, looking at both your initial remarks and Robert's own, one thing that comes out is you made a comment that the transition to electric vehicles for Africa will be rapid, because if our sources dry up, of course, we are forced to change with our suppliers. However, there is also the implication in that statement that the source vehicles last for, let's say, 20 years. I mean, the fleet is 20 years. When they are switching to EVs, of course, it means that there will be cheaper internal combustion vehicles available. What are your thoughts about that? Those vehicles being dumped on our continent? Number one.
Thank you, Gad, for that. The key point to note is they'll not only be cheaper, but they'll be available ICE for exports from the developing countries and these countries which are vehicle manufacturers. But what is also important to note is that the policies which will likely come into effect will not favor the importation of ICE over time. That's, you just need to watch the space, how it's going. Already you can see, even in terms of in Africa now, if you just drive around, maybe from Cape Town to Joburg and from Cape Town to Cairo, you notice in all the countries the prices of fuel has just skyrocketed within a short period of time. Just that is less than 24 months. The price of fuel has just skyrocketed, and it's not coming down. So I'd like to reiterate that as much as the cheaper ICE vehicles will be available for exports or for imports, that is to Africa and other developing countries, they will not be favorable for use in terms of the economics. And that's why people will have to resort to alternative means of transportation, and the alternative there will be in terms of the EVs. We're not saying that, and I like what Robert has said, fuel has really transformed the world over the last 100 years. We're not saying it's bad. We are just saying that it's good to also provide an alternative. Look, if I need to move around, I should have an alternative, such that if I want to burn fuel, well and good. If I want to use electric, well and good. So that's where the transition will be. Will people be just importing ICE because it's cheaper, and at the end of the day it's expensive to use because of fuel price? Or will people be importing EVs which will be used again, which will have a lifespan? Because, you know, at the end of the day, we are not only looking at only importing EVs, African countries are also looking towards manufacturing these EVs. And countries are now becoming so strong in terms of manufacturing. Countries want to build their manufacturing base so that they can also create employment for their population. So those are the dynamics that will have to be tackled with time.
I was saying that a follow-up to that, to you. In 2019, I believe, I and my colleague Moderator, that's Olukokun, we had cause to discuss at length about a certain statement from the Nigerian Assembly, where I think one of the senators, or a parliamentarian, I don't know how the classification, actually stood on the floor and said that they must do everything possible to resist the adoption of electric vehicles because Nigeria is a major oil exporter. Okay. The other side of that, and that shows a way of thinking. the other side of that is that there are even countries on the continent who are not major oil exporters or producers. However, they are major consumers. And you would discover that invariably, the oil business on the continent is dominated by either politicians or politically exposed people or people who are influencers of politicians. How does that factor affect the point you just made? Knowing well that policy can have a huge impact on usage or adoption rates.
Thank you very much, Gad, for that. You see, these fuel exporting countries, and they are well known in the world. And that has been their dominant market over the last, let's talk, over 100 years or so. And the world is going through a transition. It's not caused by us, not me, not Robert, not you. It's just the world is going through a transition. And when the world is going through a transition, already we have statements from major vehicle manufacturing companies which already have stated clearly and categorically, some from 2025, like if you check in Norway, some from 2035, some from 2030, that they will go fully towards manufacturing of only EVs. Now, when you have such bold statements coming from such countries and such vehicle manufacturers, what happens to this oil marketing company, these oil exporting countries? At the end of the day, you might have oil you're exporting, but again, also the time that you have to export that oil will be diminishing. So it just calls for everyone to sit and look at the bigger picture towards transitioning to how the world wants to be transitioned to. And we're not saying that it will disappear tomorrow, but there is a time frame. There's a time frame which will have to be followed. And oil will still be there, and it will still be important, such that in cases, for example, such as aviation, oil will still be very, very important. Mining, oil will still be very, very important. You know, there are areas where oil will still be important for quite a significant period of time before they are transitioned, and oil will still even be used to even carry out other services and other important services in the economy. I'd like to give you an example. A country like Kenya, for example, uses close to about 350 billion Kenya shillings to import oil every year. That's a lot of money, which can be channeled. It's actually close to, that's a lot of money which can be channeled towards using, that money can be channeled towards using, to be used towards providing services for other sectors in the economy, if a portion of it could just be saved. So I've just given you that notion, and this affects a majority of African countries and developing countries, whereby we export very light currency and import very heavy currency.
Right. I think, Robert, I have some questions from you from some of our participants. So I will just read. The first one is from Christopher Shem Luadanga from Uganda. He has a series of questions. Number one, okay, I think Robert just answered this one. Sorry, David just answered this one. Where does the adoption of electric vehicles leave the the oil industry? Now, can the currently installed distribution grid sustain the upcoming EV charging loads? Number one, Robert. Number two, are EVs expected to reach price parity with conventional vehicles? Second question from him. And then, okay, would that lead to the ocean? But okay, so I think those are the two questions for you from Christopher. Then from I think I saw him.
Yes, I'm here.
Good. Africa has a greater responsibility for the environmental resiliency and immobility promotion. And he spoke about the fact that some African countries are innovating. A lot of the people on the call are actually doing things in the space, including him in Togo. So his question was along the lines of promoting people like that, and then basically promoting people like that, and then I think financing their activities. What kind of financing opportunities are available for people like that in the space? And then Lembo Zigu from South Africa, do you believe Africa will convert to EVs in the same conventional manner of just buying new cars, like a developed world, or will you have retrofitting, that is converting of used ICE vehicles into electric vehicles, like it's been done in some of the developed world? And then what was that? Okay, I think that was the question. So will we go by buying brand new electric vehicles, or do you think that we'll get the used ICE vehicles and convert them into electric? Then another one from Salambere Anere from Burkina Faso. Okay, he's saying that, okay, looking at our weather condition, will using this type of vehicle be beneficial? I think you addressed that in your earlier, how do you call it? Initial statement. And how would the West help African countries efficiently implement this EV adoption agenda? Then I have from Evans comment from Kenya, the last one. Is Africa ready for e-mobility?
Well, that's a fantastic question for a start. Really, really interesting. So let's start with the first few. So the speed of EV adoption is really hard to predict, and it's going to be different speeds in different countries. But it is gaining momentum. So there is a graph that's being used a lot in the UK, for instance, where I'm most familiar with. And it's been so slow for the last 10 years, like this, a tiny increase every year in the number of electric vehicles until last year, until 2022, when it went off the scale, literally off the scale. So we went from under 1% of new cars being electric, being sold in the UK, to about 28% in a few months. So it was a really dramatic change. And you can see it on the roads in the UK. The amount of electric vehicles is enormous. So that's one. So that is, and what that means is in 10 years' time, there will be an enormous market of second-hand electric cars, even in 5 years' time, in fact. And that is growing very fast, which is, in a sense, it may have an impact on Africa. The discussions around the grid being able to cope with the demand of electricity, two critically important things is, one, if everyone plugs their car in, say like in Norway, let's say Norway, where there's really, really the most electric cars any country's got. If everyone plugged their car in at exactly the same time and started charging them at exactly the same time, even in Norway with a very strong grid and a huge amount of renewable energy at their disposal, it would cause problems. It's a really simple solution that when you plug a car in, the charger doesn't necessarily charge that car straight away. It charges it when the electricity is abundant and cheap and clean. And that's what all the technology that's being developed around electric cars makes that absolutely simple for us to use as people that drive the cars. So, and also you've got to remember that energy can go both ways. It can come from a car, say to a house or to a factory or to another car, as well as go into the car. So It's a much more fluid exchange. And if we think of electricity in the same way that we think of liquid fuels, of gasoline and petrol, we've got to change the way we think. You don't drive a car and then you have to fill it up really quickly and then drive it further. With an electric car, you're charging it all the time, you're not using it. And that's got to be a critical change in the way we think. So when you're not using a car, when it's parked, when it's still, when it's not being used, when there's no one in it, that's when it's charging. So when you get in it, it's always full. And you don't have to think about, oh, I've got to buy some gasoline, or I've got to whatever. So I don't think the grid will collapse. I think the grid will adapt, and because it's going to be slow. You know, we're not going to suddenly have 1 million electric cars in Africa overnight. It's going to take some years, and you'll develop the grid to support that. But another critically important thing to remember is when you have an oil refinery, and this will definitely apply to countries like Nigeria. An oil refinery uses a huge amount of electricity, about the same as a large city. And the electricity is used in the process of refining oil. If we don't refine as much oil, we don't use that electricity to refine the oil, we then have a lot more a capacity to charge cars. And that's a really critically important thing. And it's a thing that I didn't know. And I make TV shows about how things are made. And I've been in an oil refinery many years ago to see how they make oil, how they turn oil into all the products we use. And it was amazing, but I didn't know how much electricity is used to produce those things. It's staggering amount of electricity. So the less oil we're refining, the more excess capacity we'll have. The EV price will definitely come down. So all the predictions about when buying a new electric car costs the same as buying a new petrol car, everyone is now agreeing it's around about 2025. So about 2 years' time, the cost of an average, four-seater electric car will be the same as an average four-seater petrol car. It won't be any different. And that is all to do with the manufacturing base for batteries, which is still in its very early stages, but they are, I've now been seeing they've been called gigafactories because they produce more than a gigawatt hour of storage capacity a year. So there's now probably 20 under construction around the world in different countries. And this is what really upsets me is there should be some in Africa. You should have at least 2 or 3 really big battery factories in Africa because you have the materials in that country to make them exactly the same as in Australia. There are correlations between Africa and Australia because Australia has all these raw materials which they dig up, they export to countries like China, Korea, Japan, where they're refined and made into products which then come back into Australia, which people buy. And you go, shouldn't we shorten that down? Dig it up here, make something with it here, use it here. Makes so much more sense around the world. That is a thing that we should be trying to facilitate. And the employment and the income you would get from producing the final product in Africa would be a real change to the whole world, in effect. So, I think the EV price will come down. It's going to take a while. There's all sorts of things that have delayed it, as always, with the COVID, with, political stresses, all those sort of things. The one point I really want to make, which I think is really relevant to Africa, is in a couple of weeks' time, I'm going to see a very big company in Australia that are converting existing Toyota Hilux and Land Cruiser trucks to electric drive. They're not doing 1 or 2 specialist, expensive conversions where they take a long time doing it. They're doing 8,500 this year. They have a machine that takes out the engine and the gearbox, and they have a unit that fits back into the car, which is the battery and the electric drivetrain and the software, all built outside the vehicle and then fitted in. That sort of technology is incredibly is going to be developed very, very sophisticatedly. It's quite sophisticated technology, but very transportable, i.e. you could use the existing truck fleet that you have in Africa of pickup trucks, of SUVs, of four-wheel drive vehicles, and you can convert those actually quite simply and not that expensively to electric drive. And that change makes so much sense because we have these amazing machines that work. The one thing that goes wrong with them, 9 times out of 10, the one thing that goes wrong with a Toyota is the engine. It's not the the drivetrain, it's not the wheels, it's not the steering, it's not the lights, it's the engine breaks down and you have to rebuild the engine and do all that stuff. If you can take that engine out and get rid of it, and then you have an electric drive in the same truck, you have the same capabilities, if not better, of driving in difficult situations. You have the same load carrying capacity. You will have a similar range. You will use the car differently because it's an electric car. But that, to upgrade our existing vehicles makes so much more sense than buying new ones. And that technology has taken a while to develop, but I really see now there's going to be companies around the world that will develop those systems to make that transition from a gasoline, a liquid fuel engine to an electric motor, electric drive, much, much simpler. And you will be able to buy a pack on a pallet, and you take out the engine and gearbox and you put that in on a crane, you bolt it in, you switch it on, and off you go. And that's going to get simpler and simpler. And it's a really, really important industry. And I mean, there are ample opportunities to be involved in that and to develop that in Africa, because it would make a very quick change around. And I mean, it's going to be fascinating to see how they do it. And as I mentioned, the truck, when I spoke earlier, the big truck, that was a big diesel truck. Up until 2 years ago, that was a big diesel truck. And this isn't an experimental vehicle. This vehicle moves a trailer with 55 tons of sand in it. It's working every day. It does long shifts every day, moving sand around to building sites in Australia. And that's its job. And the guy who drives it goes, I love this truck. It's so much nicer to drive than the old diesel one, because it's very quiet, it's very smooth, it's very powerful. When it comes to a hill with 55 tons of sand on it, it doesn't slow down. It doesn't have to go down through the gears. It just keeps going at the same speed all the time. When it goes down the hill, this is also critically important, especially in a big truck, which uses a lot of electricity. It generates an enormous amount of electricity through regeneration because of the weight and because of the fact that weight is pushing that truck down a hill. Well, you don't need to use the brakes. You use the motor to slow the truck down, and that generates an enormous amount of power. And when we're talking about a truck with 55 tons of sand on the back, we're talking like megawatts of power it's generating. It's staggering on that scale. This is a really big truck. This isn't a small pickup. It's a monster thing. I'm quite old. I found it quite hard to get in because it was so high up. I had to climb up the ladder to get in the truck. So that's the scale of it. So I think truck conversions, vehicle conversions, critically important and a very exciting prospect, particularly for a country like Africa.
I think one of our moderators want to have a question for you.
Maybe God,
I told you about him the last time.
Just to...
I told you about him the last time. You have the floor.
Yeah, I think David wanted to say something quickly, so I think I will allow him to do that.
Thank you. I'll take the shortest time possible just to reiterate a point. And I can see in the chat comments there, a colleague of mine, a very good friend of mine, Dennis Wakaba, has mentioned, and there was this question that you had asked whether African countries will be able to adopt the EVs, and already we can see we have companies which, such as Rome in Kenya, which is actually designing and developing electric vehicles, not only focused on which are based on the European market, but tailored for the African market, and that is in Kenya. And also, apart from doing that, they are also doing retrofitting, and that is conversion of Land Cruisers, Land Rovers to electric, and deploying 10 kilowatts to 10 megawatts of solar and stationary storage systems. So that shows you that already in terms of the manufacturing setup which Africa is thinking about, that will be able to be achieved now in the African continent and in the African market. And perhaps, who knows, maybe perhaps in future, we might not even have the used EVs coming. Maybe the countries might also ban the exportation of EVs, that is the developed countries might ban the exportation of EVs. And given that it is banned, we might have to think inwards and develop this technology. Thank you.
Can I just quickly say, it would be amazing if when someone in 10, 15, 20 years' time in Europe could buy an African-built car because they want an African-built car. So it's going the other way. So the cars are built in Africa, and there's people in Europe go, oh, I want one of those. They look really good. I'm just saying that would be an amazing change in the world.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you, David. Thank you, Robert. I mean, both of your expressions are related to my question. Also, we had a conversation last year with somebody from the UN who was looking at exporting our product, bicycles, cargo bike, to Europe, especially to Sweden. I mean, and that's so fascinating. Your vision could be, realized quicker than 20 years that you mentioned. So my question is in two ways for both of you to answer. Number one, for David, considering the adoption rates in Africa, do you think it is profitable for those manufacturing companies that are trying to embark in manufacturing in Africa, especially for EVs, the light truck or the sedan or the small ones? Do you think it's worth the investment to start a manufacturing plant? Or is it better to have an assembly plant where you get knocked down or semi-knocked down from China or whatever and just come and assemble? That's for you. Now, the same question flipped to Robert. Is there any company in the world thinking of Africa? Do they even have Africa or the African market in plan for their products right now? Because we say Africa is the future, and a lot of companies see opportunity there. Do you think there is any of these global companies manufacturing EV or planning to manufacture EV in Africa? Would they want to export to Africa, or are they trying to manufacture in Africa? What's in the plan? What is the plan of the world right now concerning Africa when it comes to EV? Thank you.
EVs are quite specialized in terms of manufacturing, and I think up to when we get it right on just one thing, the battery, then we can go fully to manufacture the entire EV technology. And even countries have to share that knowledge in terms of vehicle manufacturing with the battery. But I would just say, for me, from the point where we are, it's very difficult to predict how it will go, but mostly the arrow is pointing towards EV. It will be the best time now to set up the manufacturing plants and the assembly plants. You can see already we have companies such as Rome in Kenya, which are already setting up assembly and manufacturing, and they are already geared up towards it. And as even Robert has said, before it was the West supplying Africa. Maybe in future it will be Africa supplying the West. Thank you.
Yes, I think, well, the one thing I'm afraid I don't know, and I think it's very stupid of those companies, is I don't know of any company that is thinking of manufacturing electric cars or building plants to manufacture batteries or cars in Africa. I'm quite confident there probably is, and I'm sure it's being discussed, but I'm not personally aware of that. I've not heard that discussed, but believe me, from now on, I'm going to be asking, because I think it's a really important point. There's some of the questions I've seen in the chat box. One specifically I think is worth mentioning, which is about battery technology and whether that will change. So at the moment, the most common batteries are lithium-ion cells. That's what's in a car like a Tesla or in many electric cars, and some use pouch cells. That's the one thing that we do know is that the technology has developed a great deal in the last 10 years, really, really extraordinary changes. And electric cars are still expensive, but that is because the batteries have got much bigger, not in physical size or weight, but much bigger capacity. So let's say 12, 13 years ago, the Nissan Leaf, I have one of the very first Nissan Leafs, that original battery was 24 kilowatt hours. Well, now the same size and the same weight battery holds 60 kilowatt hours. Well, that's happened in 10 years. And that means that the car goes much, much further on one charge. So that technology is changing. But the one thing that we've seen, so in the United States and in UK and in Europe, there are dozens of universities and companies that have been set up that are developing new battery chemistry, new battery technology that doesn't use contentious materials like cobalt. And it uses much cheaper materials, and they are much more energy dense, and they last longer. They can be charged and discharged more times. One of those technologies is going to work. I would not want to predict which one now, it's too soon, but in the next 5 years, we're going to see battery technology that really changes the picture yet again, because they will be cheaper, smaller, lighter, and last longer. And every time you increase the energy density and increase the lifespan of a battery, the more chance there is of us burning less fossil fuel. And those batteries will obviously be used in vehicles, but there's also battery technology that's much, much cheaper that's being used for static storage. As David mentioned, one of the really critical ways that we can adopt and use more renewable energy is through having batteries. So in my house in England, I have batteries and solar panels in England, where everybody goes, the sun never shines. It does sometimes. We get some sunny days every now and then. And it means that your reliance on buying expensive electricity from elsewhere is reduced. So even in England, I can reduce my electricity bill by an enormous amount. And that's by having batteries. And the batteries really make a difference, because then when it's dark at night, I can still use the electricity that I've received in the day from the solar panels. So, the whole picture is going to change, and it's just very difficult to predict right now how soon and exactly how. So I don't place bets, but I'm very confident we will have incredible battery technology in the next 5 years.
Okay, I think John is raising his hand.
Okay, thank you very much. My question actually is to David, and Robert has actually touched on it. China, what are they going to do with all their second-hand vehicles? We know that 70% of all the electric vehicles in the world currently are in China. Do we see a change in the trend, in the sense that maybe perhaps Africa could now start importing their vehicles from China? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's a question that requires some bit of more research and investigation, and I'd like to come back to you with more information, and information that is also justifiable and reliable. So maybe in our next engagement, I'll be able to provide you a clear answer, because when you looked at our research, which you presented, our study, we didn't focus much on China, but China is now emerging as a strong vehicle distributor globally, and now China and India, and we now need to focus on them strongly. Thank you.
Robert, we have 4 minutes, so maybe I will let you answer the questions in the chat. That's from Wakabi. He said that you recently he wants to know about battery degradation, because you recently changed the battery in your Nissan Leaf. As you can see, we are avid followers of your content, number one. And number two, he wants to know about range anxiety. That is a very good one, because you see that the way we use, people think of EVs the way they use their ICE vehicles. That's their reference point. So range anxiety is a thing. So how has range anxiety evolved for you as somebody who is an avid follower of EVs and who is also a long-time user of EVs? So maybe
okay
for that, and then
do that quickly. So we have changed the battery on our Nissan Leaf, because the Nissan Leaf was really one of the first electric cars to be mass produced. And I've always said the Nissan Leaf batteries were a problem when they were brand new, and they're still a problem now. It's very specific to that make of car. So there is a very good example of the opposite end, which is, and in fact, a Tesla Model S in America that had just passed 1 million miles, not kilometers, miles, so 1,250,000 kilometers on the same battery. But it's important to point out everything else on the car had broken, worn out, been replaced, been fixed. The motors, the suspension, the steering, the lights, everything. But the battery was still going. So the battery was worn down. It wasn't as good as when it was new, but it was still working after 1 million miles. Now, that is unheard of, and that was an exceptional example. But we are looking at really essentially a battery that will outlast the car, not the other way around. The car will fall to bits before the battery is worn out. And another important thing is once you've reached the end of a usable life of a battery in a car, you take the battery out and you put it in a box and you join it to a building. And it can be a battery for the building for another 10 to 15 years. So the lifespan of a battery is now considered to be more like 20 to 30 years of useful life. So starting in a vehicle and then ending up as a static storage. So that, I think, is really important, a really important point that the technology has changed and is developing and is lasting much longer than anyone thought. No one knew really when we started making electric cars how long those would last. The other thing about range anxiety is when you first drive an electric car, you will have range anxiety because you've been told for years that you will have range anxiety, and you will, and I did, and everybody does. And the second time you drive it, you have a little bit less range anxiety. By the 10th time you drive it, you don't even remember what range anxiety is. And that is very dependent on how you use a vehicle. But even, I did check this, even in Africa, in every country around the world, the average distance that a vehicle travels in a day, a private car travels, is under 50 kilometers. Well, there's no electric cars that drive under 50 kilometers. They all do 250, 300, 400 kilometers. So what people discover very quickly is they charge their car once a week, very much like you buy gasoline. So range anxiety was a marketing term for advertising used by General Motors 20 years ago to promote the big petrol cars. And you don't want to get an electric car because you'll get range anxiety. No, range anxiety is a myth. I've had range anxiety in petrol cars when I ran out of petrol in the middle of the night and it was raining. That's bad. That's range anxiety.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists. Unfortunately, we are out of time. But David, I think what this panel has taught us is that we need to create another panel for each one of you individually. Putting it together is too rich a panel. So we need to have a dedicated fora for you, and we'll organize that in due course. But our next session will be on the 23rd of February. It will be moderated by Dr. Joseph Ramirezai Kuhuzai of Zimbabwe. The panelists are our own Olukokun Tolulope, who is a moderator, the director of e-mobility for AfricaNEV, as well as the CEO of Think Bikes. We have Tom Cartwright, who is the research director for IAMDA. And we have Brahim Lazrak, who is, I forgot the name of his organization, but they are producing two-wheelers in Morocco. And then we have Chris Mara from Kenya. He is also into two-wheelers. So as you can see, Robert, there are a lot of things happening on the continent. Thank you very much to our audience. Without much ado, I'll hand over to our host to close us. Aluora.
Thank you so much to our very able panelists, and we hope that we'll have such a forum again to a bit more time to exchange. So I've posted the Twitter handles for both the speakers in the chat, so you can follow up there. I hope you don't mind, I took the leverage. But please feel free to share your contacts in the 2 minutes in case you have, you're open to sharing your email addresses. It would be good for everybody to have that. Please reach us at AfricaNEV on Twitter, and feel free to chat with us for more information. Thank you so much for taking time to be with us. We hope to see you next time, and we'll keep you posted. So have a good evening, have a good day. Those who are just starting the day, Robert. And for the rest, good night to you. Thank you so much, and bye-bye.